What up, everybody? Rich Gage 20 here. Back with another Mr. Ballen story. Today we got the secret group of geniuses kill for fun. It's kind of weird that, like, I'm trying to think, maybe not so weird. It's like a bunch of people that are really, really smart get together, but instead they decide to use their time and their intelligence and their knowledge for murder instead of actually trying to do anything to help. But that could be just like just fed up with society in general, because society's so fucking stupid that they're just like, these people deserve to die. I could see that. I could feel that, you know what I mean? I promise I'm not part of any kind of secret group of geniuses. I know I seem to be the most intelligent human being you've ever met. I know you were thinking it. But I promise I'm not. I don't kill. For fun. Profit, however. No, just kidding. Though in some of these stories, like that one about the dude in the woods, I would have 100% killed that person just to make it stop. Like, just to make it stop. I was either gonna go down dead or kill that motherfucker. Cause like by the third time when the dude came up to the tent and started talking to him through the tent, I would have just came out and been like, all right, dude, knife out, just like, here we go. We're gonna do this. Let's do this, motherfucker. Let's go. You know, and I would have fight to the death right then and there. But you know, in general, I don't like to kill. So I've never actually killed anybody. So like, well, hopefully I get to keep that track record till the day I die. But you never know. Life happens. We'll see what happens. Anyways, secret group of geniuses kill for fun. Let's see how this story fucking goes.
In 1988, a waitress who was living in Central Florida had just begun her shift at a local diner when she's standing in the middle of the restaurant and her heart just starts racing like mad. Now, she had not been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense. And so, kind of startled by what was happening, she just turned around and went straight into the bathroom and sat down in a stall, waiting for this sensation to pass. But as she sat there, her heart just continued to beat like mad, and then she began to feel tingling in her feet and in her arms. And it was at that moment that she realized she was having a heart attack.
Right.
Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come ballroom dancing with you, but when you get out on the dance floor, just start stomping all over their feet, but don't acknowledge it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
What?
Peggy Carr's life had never been very easy. She was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with.
Yeah. I mean, I do a little bit of that myself, especially when I'm I live in a bad neighborhood, so whenever I'm walking around at a market of some kind, like a Walmart, Safeway, you know, whatever happens to be around, Freddy's, you never know, or when I'm just driving, I always put on a face that says, don't fuck with me, because I'll fuck you up while I'm blasting some crazy fucking music, and, you know, so, try to put on this front of, I will fuck you up, just to try to probably like, that person might be crazy, I don't want to fuck with that person, you know what I mean? So like, I get it. Been there, done that.
Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Ballen Carr. Ballen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot...
Pie. Oh, that's not Ellen. No, don't go by Ellen. Go by Pie. Okay, that name alone is a fishy-ass name. You don't... Nah, dog. I'm trying to think of a last name. Yeah, it's like if someone had a name Vorticious Stroot. Like, you just know they up to no good, man. Like, come on. You just, like, that's just a name that just says, nah. You know what I'm saying? Like, come on. No, you don't fuck with that. What are you doing, Peggy?
Like Peggy.
You're desperate,
he was
Peggy.
a recently
That's
divorced
what you be
single
doing.
father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pie, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pie is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day.
Well, who doesn't
and
know
then,
Pie?
just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pie and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pie.
So, I'm going to use this opportunity as a PSA for people. One of the many reasons, just because it's hard to be with another human being for a long period of time. It's just a hard thing to do. But one of the many reasons why the divorce rate is so high is people like get that super rush of, oh my god, I love this person so much, and they get married within like 4 to 12 months of knowing each other. You don't know who you're with in that period of time. Trust me. I spent 4 years with a person, and then we got married a year later. It's 5 years with someone before I got married to them. And little warning signs and stuff I didn't know about this person started to sprout up after we got married. You think after 3 or 4 months, you know this person? You know that everything's gonna be good? You know that there can't possibly be a demon in that closet? I swear, you kids these days get married so fast. Just fuck that. Person's gotta go at least 5 years before I'm even considering marrying them. They gotta prove that they the real deal. That's all I'm saying. Like, you gotta put in work if you want to marry this. That's all I'm saying.
And his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pie and his kids, Peggy and Pie started to have marital issues.
Weird how that works.
It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished,
Crazy.
and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an...
And the name of this credit is True Crime Central Murder She Solved. Interesting. Did she solve the murder by being murdered? We'll find out.
affair. And so Pi, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side.
Of course.
And so from the outside look,
that wouldn't be fucked up if one of them chose the other one's side, be like, nah, I think you're right, this one clearly crazy. Fucked up. Then you know you fucked up your own kids against you.
In, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last.
No.
But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these two families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip, he just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later. And so Pi, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing, and she had not been running around.
And Pi GTFO'd. Try to alibi like I wasn't even there. Let's see what you're doing, Pi. By the way, that name's still suspicious as a motherfucker, but he might not even be involved in this whatsoever. He might die too out on his trip. It might be a different group that decides to kill both of them. We'll see.
The restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just gonna go home, I'm gonna lay down.
No. Nah, there ain't no go home and sleep off a heart attack. At the point you're having these heart attack symptoms, it's too late for you. Like, you go to the hospital is what you do. I mean, 80s was simpler at the time. A heart attack, I sleep that off. It's regular Sunday for me. I don't know. But, like, yeah, you go and you tell people, like, hey, but BT Dub's having a heart attack. Someone call an ambulance. I'm going to sit here for a little bit.
If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously, so I'm going to leave for the day. And
I want to take it seriously, so I'm not going to go to the hospital just to double check. You never know. I mean, I don't know what insurance was like back in the 80s, and I'm sure they didn't have, like, fuckloads of money for trying to raise, 5 kids? You know what I mean? It does sound like they have at least 2 to 3 sources of income, so I mean, I don't know if the teenage daughter takes that income for herself or splits any with the family. I don't know. But yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is a money issue or whatnot, but like, probably you could probably go to the hospital. You know what I mean? Just in case. You never know.
So Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's going to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door. She got in her car and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty, so she just went inside. She made her way to her bedroom and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne, because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick. And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him. And so he kind of jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale. She was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort.
I mean, it's one of the reasons why you go to the hospital first. Well, I guess some kind of poison? Some kind of neuron attacking poison, but who knows? Let's find out.
He said, Mom, geez, are you okay? And she would say to him, oh no, I'm fine, I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something, I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off. And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails, and if she says she's gonna sleep something off, then she'll be just fine.
I mean, I get that. I understand. He's using. They all understand. Like, my mom's a badass. She got this. She say she got this. She got this. Like me personally, I'd be like, nah, I'm bringing you to the hospital. Like, you can sleep off some shit, sure, but you're gonna sleep that shit off in the hospital. Like, I don't know what kind of crazy ass shit you're trying to pull now, but like, you don't look good. Have you looked at yourself? You don't look good. Like, you look like you about to pass out. I'm taking you to the hospital.
And so Dwayne said, okay, well, let me know if you need anything. And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back, and she would level with him, and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins.
Venom. Yeah, but that's poison right there. That's 100% poison.
In my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight, no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. Yeah. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance. But something needs to be done.
Someone needs to get you to the hospital.
Despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting.
Oh, good. Good. Pi's here, everybody. Pi's here. This can't do anything but be good.
Trip. He would come in the house, and right away Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, hey, this is not normal. My mom never ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital. But Pi would actually say, nah, she's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. Yeah, she'll sleep it off. But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, okay, I'll take her to the hospital. And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling.
The vomiting is a defense mechanism to try to get poison out of the body. You know, just putting that one out there. Also, there's still like 30 minutes to this story. We haven't even gotten to the secret group of geniuses yet. So, there's going to be some twists and turns up in this bitch. Oh, wrong one. Beep. There we go.
Spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, do you have any idea what could have caused this? And they all said, no, she just suddenly started feeling this way. And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room.
I think they call it neurotoxin or something like that. I feel like that's what's going on here, but I don't know. Maybe that is detectable in blood. But would you have to be scanning for that? Would it just come back there's some anomaly in your blood system? I don't know.
And begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again. She was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable. Her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially, everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend, but within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out, the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite
I mean, they can provide at least pain relief in some way, shape, or form. I know it's expensive, but like, I mean, they can maybe help it from escalating to a serious and deadly position.
Laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse.
Wait, this is the 80s. Nanobots is little, There's some mechanisms in their bloodstream. Probably like, wait, this is the 80s. But they are geniuses.
Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting these same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day the results came back and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And then at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical...
I mean, I'm probably wrong because I'm always wrong in these, but that really sounds like some kind of neurotoxin. But it could be some fantasy realm I'm living in right now, but like...
condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way.
This is gonna be Yep. This is
We've
gonna
all been there. You're the host for the big summer barbecue. The guest...
I knew it was gonna be an ad.
There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra-intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived, in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to...
And I'm guessing eventually at one point, practice and just pretending and role-playing just wasn't good enough. As long as I'm guessing, maybe one of them just broke free and was like, I just want to actually kill people. Or maybe they all did it as a group. Who knows? Well, they know, we know, but like I don't know. So I'm saying who knows.
The real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter, and they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself. She's moved to a brand new area. She's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costume.
Did this girl take what this perfect crime was and then attempt it in real life? Is that what is that what happened here? If so, that's fucking crazy that someone invented almost the perfect way to commit a crime, and only like a super genius would be able to solve what was happening and how it went down, and then actually use that on someone mundane to where even most doctors wouldn't be able to test it to figure it out. That's what happened. That's fucking crazy. That's fucking insane.
They packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character, and everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about, and he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon, and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body, and how you can get it, and what the history of this weapon was.
Okay, why did you tell her how to get it though? Like, you could have added all that other stuff, the history of it and what it does to the body and whatnot, but, like, at what point do you be like, this is how you get it in case you're curious? I mean, like, come on now. Oh.
And Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then, over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart, that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, you know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not. And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their...
I wonder if there was anything that made this targeted, like, obviously I'm assuming we're going to find out here, but I'm just thinking as we go along, I'm wondering if there's anything that made this targeted towards these two people, or if she just needed someone to try this out on, and guess who happened to be the neighbors. If it's the second one, that's rather unfortunate. That's, like, incredibly unfortunate.
House key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family.
Damn, she wasn't even living there for more than a few hours. The bitch got dragged off to fucking prison.
A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they...
They're just like, oh, who bought this? That's weird. And they drank it? Oh, man, that's why you never drink anything that someone else gives you. I mean, if you don't know them and don't trust them or you didn't see them make it.
Set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and
Must have gotten them. Don't ask. Why ask? I mean, soda, in theory, should be harmless, right? Right, you're harmless, right? You little motherfucker. I'm watching you. In theory, it should be harmless, right? So I guess that makes sense. It's just like, yeah, I guess if all of them have some form of income, like, you know, her daughter works and whatnot, then I guess it wouldn't be that crazy. You know? I mean, I'm sure there's been many situations, many families is just like, hey, did you guys buy this? And like, no, we didn't get it. And like, huh, well, whatever, I guess we'll just drink it. I could see that. It's trying to not look at it the light that I know something's up. And, you know, when you have a giant family like that, especially one that doesn't necessarily all get along, it can be pretty easy to be like, fuck it, I'm sure someone bought it. You know? So that also makes sense why it affected multiple people in the family.
left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else.
Right.
Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium.
Metal in the body. I did mention metal. Nanobots.
Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms
I told you it was poison in some form.
was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning, but the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. Way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her there's nothing you can do with your body.
You're just dead. I'm sorry. Like, there's nothing we can do to help you. Yeah.
Is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, you know, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation.
I do gotta check something real fast. I just wanna. It can affect your nervous system. So, you know, your nervous system, some kind of neurotoxin or something. I'm just, you know, maybe it's a stretch, but I'm just saying.
And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick. And so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium?
No.
And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really...
Well, I mean, you know, you poison the whole family, but low doses, and you poison her in a higher dose to make sure she dies. Everyone else makes a recovery. But then you're banking on the fact that the doctors are going to know what's wrong with you and be able to cure you. So that's a gamble right there. That would be a gamble. I don't think you take that one.
Add up. And so Pye would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note.
Oh yeah, that wouldn't be important. Like, who doesn't get death threats? Like that's nothing. That's just minor. Cops won't be able to draw any conclusions from that.
That said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all going to die. But Pye thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it.
But it says this is no joke on it. Like, if someone says it's not a joke, then it's not a joke. If it's a joke, they'd be like, yo, bro, it's just a prank, you know? But, like, if they say this is no joke, you gotta take that seriously. At least at some level, you gotta take that seriously.
And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pye out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects.
Well, yeah.
And so they just began...
Because they had like no interactions with this woman as far as I know. So, like, why would she poison them? That is a fantastic question. I don't think anyone can really answer. But maybe
focusing
we can
on
get one.
who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Galeck, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pye. It would
Now this is a twist. The other story had a little bit of a twist. Now this is a fucking twist. It actually isn't her. Those two... Fucking... those two sent the death threat. I mean, maybe there's another twist on top of this twist, but like, sent the death threat and came up with this plan. And then they left. They moved somewhere else. And she lived in there. Or she crooked. She could be a crooked cop, but they did it and tried to bounce, and she was only specifically getting in there to try to catch them in whatever criminal activity that they were involved in. Because sometimes role play specifically, is just not enough.
Turnout, Diana and George hated Peggy, Pye, and their kids.
I mean, it makes sense if they're arguing, screaming at each other all the time, and like, it's a tiny house full of a bunch of kids that screaming and yelling all the time. Like, I can see that, but I mean, it doesn't mean you kill them. You can just move.
Hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr, she had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pye and the...
Come on, you guys are supposed to be geniuses. That automatically gives you a motive. People gonna be checking you out. Like, come on now.
Their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pye, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. Yeah. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pye and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pye and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pye reads it, Nothing happens. They don't leave
Well, of
Florida
course
within
not.
2 weeks, and so
would
George
they?
went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium.
I mean, it never said he used meth. So he's smart enough to cook meth and not use it. That's... What? Dog. That's crazy. That's absolutely fucking nutty. I did not see this story go in this direction.
And he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them.
Is a bottle topping machine? Who just has that?
George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at
Got
his
it.
house.
Thank you for
And so with
elaborating.
his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house, and then he snuck
Dude,
over.
that is Grand Theft level attention to detail skills right there. Like studying the patterns of when they're home and when they're not, knowing when they'll be open and available to get in and get. And you know, being a genius, you probably know how to lockpick, I would imagine. So like, wow, that is crazy.
And he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house, and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors.
Right.
And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was.
Yeah,
I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their
Right.
things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched
Guess what?
George
The
and
first fucking thing she did. So much for geniuses. There's so much for geniuses here. Left all the murder stuff in the house. You're supposed to be a genius, right? See, sometimes the word genius just gets thrown around a little bit.
Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house. They searched it top to bottom, and in the garage they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife, Diana,
Wasn't
who
this the
many
80s?
people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning or must have at least known it was happening,
Right.
was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry.
I mean, fuck. Dude, fuck.
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's
Fuck, dude. Like, I mean, if she did have something to do with it, she would actually be one of the smart ones who'd be like, hey, I can't you know, I can't. It would make me not look guilty if I like, oh, horrible man, you did a horrible thing. I'm divorcing you, and I'm gonna find someone else. Or trying to. It would definitely separate you since they don't have any evidence on you being involved in any way, shape, or form. There. That is crazy. So the secret group does kill for fun, but it's, role playing fun. However, one of them actually did kill for their own enjoyment. Now, you know, I was right about poison. I don't know if that technically counts as neurotoxin or not, but like, I mean, it's a poison that attacks the nervous system, so it's pretty close, if not spot on. So maybe I am a secret genius, as I mentioned up top. It's whatever. I just got an eye for these things. You know what I mean? I'm never wrong on these suggestions. It's whatever. Alright, I'll do it for another one of these stories here. Another banger. I need to start. Like, all of these titles are a flip. They're all, they're all misleading intentionally, which is good because otherwise it'd be maybe a little too obvious what happened. That one had twists and turns. He directed the story to make you think that this girl was up to something, and that maybe she just chose them at random just because she really wanted to, focus in on, like testing this out, the perfect crime, if you will. But it actually flips it to be like their neighbors just didn't like them, so they poisoned them, or at least one of it did. And wow, dog, wow. Yeah. Just thinking through all the stuff that happened at the beginning, see if I have anything else to add into there, but I don't think I do. So yeah, those were some twists, man. Those were some twists. Those were some turns. Those were some fucking left hooks out of nowhere. I loved it. So yeah, fantastic. I really want to get into some of these other ones. It sounds like very fascinating. I don't know, we might jump around here. Who knows? I kind of like the horror based ones rather than the true crime kind of based ones. But it is what it is. Honestly, I'm sad that I already seen the blue-haired woman terrifies authorities one. That one was fucking crazy. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it yet. If you haven't seen it yet, he released about 2 months ago. Go check that shit out. It is fascinating. And I can't say it because I can't spoil anything, but like the way it ends is just crazy. It's an amazing story, just surrounded with mystery and intrigue and even some supernatural involved. It is just fascinating. So yeah, go check that shit out. And I'll see which one I'm gonna do next. I can't lie, that feral people hunting killer one sounds very exciting. I want to get kind of back into the horror stuff in here, so we'll see. Maybe we'll jump around and what have you. Thank you all very much for joining me, and I will see you all next time.